All right, welcome everyone to our first Monday seminar series from the Graduate Group in Education for the 2021-22 academic year. We're happy to be back after a busy start, and even though this quarter it wasn't any easier, we're back up again, and we're happy to bring you 4 sessions this quarter that will highlight guests like Dr. Michael Moses today, and faculty and students who are part of the GGE for the rest of the quarter. Today, we will kick off the series with Dr. Michael W. Moses II, who is a University of California Presidential Postdoctoral Fellow at UC Riverside. Dr. Moses' research explores graduate students of color and their experiences with racialized harm on campuses. He earned his PhD in education at UCLA School of Education and Information Studies. He has a recent publication in the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, which I'm really looking forward to checking out, thinking about anonymity in place names for research. So please help me welcome Dr. Michael W. Moses II to the UC Davis Graduate Group in Education. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Dr. Martinez. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for just the space and the presence this afternoon. I want to thank Dr. Martinez and Dr. Kurlander for the invitation to be with you all to share a little bit about my work, but also just to be in community and really just sort of important and critical issues around education research. So I will share my screen. And you all can see everything, correct?
Yes.
Perfect. Let me minimize this, and then I will get us going. All right, so as mentioned, I'm currently a Chancellor's Postdoctoral Fellow at UCR School of Education, completed my doctoral training in education at UCLA, and identify more broadly as a critical race scholar of racism in higher education and qualitative methodologies. Today, I'm happy to be before you to not only share with you some exciting ideas about methodological practice, but also engage us in a larger discussion about how our everyday academic norms and taking for granted assumptions have ramifications for our understandings of equity and diversity. In today's talk, titled Racialized Methodological Norms, Theorizing IRBs and Anonymity as Racism, I aim to accomplish 3 goals. First, as a newly minted PhD and junior scholar, I think it's pretty important to introduce myself in new academic spaces. So I'd like to take some time to share with you all who I am, what motivates the work that I do, and where do I see my work going more broadly. Second, I'd like to share my argument around the equity stakes of IRBs and anonymity and how they reinforce racism. This argument, as Dr. Martinez mentioned, draws from a solo-authored manuscript of mine I published earlier this past fall in the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education. In it, I argue that we, as scholars and educators, have a pressing choice to make in the hope of breaking free from what writer and activist Adrienne Maree Brown calls the white imagination and its hold on academic research. I offer a critique of research site anonymity as an unquestioned methodological norm that stifles our collective imagining of racism as a real, normal, and persisting component of American education. I do so by using Derek Bell's interest convergence as a framework to explain how anonymity prioritizes the status of institutions as protectors of white interests over the calls for institutional accountability by communities of color. By questioning whether we should anonymize research sites that engage in racist practices, I contend that scholars can imagine and actualize new educational possibilities for people of color and other minoritized populations. Lastly, I'd like to end today by discussing practical steps and considerations for how we can rethink our approach to research site anonymity to more justly represent the interests of marginalized communities. So to begin, who am I and what motivates the work that I do? At its broadest scope, my scholarly agenda is motivated by the dissonance between what academics say and do not do for racial diversity. As an academic community, we express a collective sense of rage toward the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and countless other Black people by the hands of white violence. Many of us may remember how roughly a year and a half ago, in fact, we received email after email after email proclaiming Black Lives Matter and using words like white supremacy and anti-Blackness for noticeably the first time in our collective memory. However, with the hashtag Black in the Ivory, recounting their daily encounters with racial microaggressions, Black academic Twitter offered a timely reminder that Black lives do not matter indeed. I want to note here how institutions and their responses to physical violence against Black, Brown, and Indigenous bodies are always circumstantial. They respond to public outcry beyond the four walls of academia, but rarely do they ever atone for and name the methodological, epistemological, and pedagogical violence they inflict upon communities of color. We can look to education scholars like Christine Stanley, Jessica Harris, Lori Patton Davis, among many others, who have questioned how a lack of racial diversity pervades the Eurocentric framing of academic norms. My questioning of anonymity practices partly results from my reading of Sean Harper's seminal article titled "Race Without Racism: How Higher Education Researchers Minimize Racist Institutional Norms." As a graduate student, I remember marveling at Harper's meta-approach to analyzing scholarly practice and having the bold yet admirable audacity to ask, what does it mean to study racial disparities, yet shy away from naming racism as a plausible explanation for why such disparities exist? In other words, what does it mean for us to say there's a problem, yet not name and actualize substantive remedies for said problem? Much of my work seeks to address this larger question, and I do so with a range of empirical, methodological, and theoretical projects. I first come to this work as the son of Kim and my namesake Michael Moses, who raised me in the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia. Shout out to mom and dad, pictured here. After my time as a student athlete and English major at a regional university in Southwest Georgia, I came to UCLA for a master's in African American Studies. Originally, I was interested in studying cultural and media studies because at the time, Tyler Perry, for those of you familiar with his work, was making headway for Black entertainment in the film and television industries. So I had endless questions about the politics of race and representation and their stakes for the everyday lives of Black folks. However, once I got to UCLA, specific questions began to arise for me about students of color and other historically minoritized experiences in predominantly white contexts. Some of these questions I answered in a dissertation study, which I'm currently revising for publication, that use visual elicited focus group methods to understand how undergraduates of color make sense of their contemporary racial climate experiences in relation to past representations of their campus racial history. To fund some of my future work, I recently submitted grant proposals to the Spencer Foundation to sharpen my thinking about Black graduate students and the networks they employ to matriculate and thrive in institutional contexts with a mismatch in diversity, rhetoric, and practice. This project is a multi-year ethnography of my work as a former academic writing coach with a self-sustaining working group pictured here of Black doctoral students. There's so much I'd love to share about this particular project and what's emerging for me as a researcher with both insider and outsider status with this group of students, but hopefully there'll be time to share these developing ideas at another talk on another day. But for the purposes of today, I want to share a slice of my thinking as a methodologist and offer research site anonymity and IRBs as an example to interrogate the everyday ways our academic practices normalize and sustain racism. This particular inquiry began in the classroom for me from my experiences teaching qualitative research methods. Here you can see me pictured in the back with my mentor, Teresa McCarty, pictured in the front in the teal blouse and scarf, and other students, and our students pictured amongst us. In this particular course series, students designed, collected, and analyzed their own independent qualitative studies. And early on in working with our students, I noticed an interesting pattern of writing that raised questions for me about anonymity practices. In our students' research proposals, I would come across sentence after sentence with some variation of defaulting to research site anonymity. Some example sentences included sentences like, West Coast University, WCU, is a four-year public research university located on the West Coast of the United States. Others read, as such, the focus would be on doctoral students at one institution, a large, highly selective four-year public research university on the West Coast of the United States, to be known as University of West Coast, UWC. I found this practice peculiar, as many of our students were interested in using critical social theories to analyze race-based disparities. I wondered how their studies could fulfill the aims of critical scholarship and examine power relations, the primary aim of critical social theories, if they defaulted to anonymity without thinking through the reasons for doing so. To answer this conceptual curiosity, I returned to literature integral to my training as a critical race scholar. I specifically wondered how Derek Bell's interest convergence, the idea that Black interests or minoritized interests more broadly are only accommodated when they converge with the interests of whites, could also help explain how defaulting to research site anonymity works to maintain the white interests of academic institutions. On one level, our subscription to anonymity is worth questioning because it has ramifications for how we train future researchers. I sense that many of my students mirrored how they see senior scholars write about anonymity in their own work. So in a way, our discussion today is a mindful reflection about how we mentor students to be the next generation of thoughtful researchers seeking to bring forth change and dismantle racism and other systems of oppression. On another level, today's talk invites us to think broadly about how the mismatch between institutional diversity, rhetoric, and practice pervade the everyday of academic life more than we may commonly think. With the following guiding question for today's talk, I posit the unquestioned norm of anonymity as one area that sheds additional light on the mismatch between our intentions and actions towards racial equity and justice. The question reads, how does research site anonymity as a methodological norm work to reaffirm structural racism and prioritize the interests of academic institutions? Before diving into the depths of my argument, I do want to be clear in naming that my intention here is to not question the theoretical purpose of IRBs and anonymity as measures to protect participants from harm. I acknowledge that other considerations, including the methodology of a study and protections to ensure privacy, make the topic of anonymity particularly complex to reimagine. An underlying assumption in this work for me as well is that participants' desires, needs, and safety matter most. For these reasons, I do not aim to prescribe another steadfast rule or de facto norm, asking us to always name our research site in order to quote unquote call out the racism. Such an intention would only recreate the very phenomenon of unquestioned standards that motivated me to take on this line of inquiry in the first place. Rather, I'd like for us as an academic community to think deeply about what we have come to know as methodologically quote unquote ethical and ask, who does research site anonymity as a methodological practice actually serve and benefit? This question offers myriad possibilities to consider how methodological standards reify racism and other interlocking forms of oppression. I also affirm that the decision to name and not anonymize a research site is not done merely to quote unquote call out and shame educational institutions. More importantly, this practice should be done to bring to bear for us all, educators, researchers, institutional leaders, practitioners, how racism permeates the everyday of American education and culture more broadly. When we not only name racism a la Sean Harper, but also the educational institutions that profit from it, we engage in a scholarly practice of naming truth to power and building a culture of ethically minded responsibility, which ultimately holds us accountable to those who benefit most from racism and its impacts on folks of color. So what do we know currently about anonymity? Although anonymity is in its own field of study, some scholars, both at home here in the States and abroad in the UK, have critiqued anonymity and its limitations, particularly for qualitative scholars and ethnographers. Jan Nesper noted how anonymity obscures connections, leaking places, writers, participants, and readers by decoupling sites and events from specificities of historic and geographic context. Jeffrey Walford has broadly discussed the quote unquote impossibility of anonymity, but has also expanded upon Nesper's notion of decoupling to argue how anonymity also provides misleading claims about qualitative findings transferability. Although this literature is helpful to begin thinking through the limitations of anonymity, what's missing is an explicit theorizing of race, but more importantly, racism as a structural system of oppression. So I use Derek Bell's interest convergence as a framework to understand the racialized implications of anonymity. Derek Bell, for those of you who may not know, one of the founding scholars of critical race theory, and his interest convergence framework is useful to explain the interdependent ways racial progress coincides with social privileges for whites. A bare-bone understanding of Bell's interest convergence goes as follows. The interests of Blacks in achieving racial equality will only be accommodated when it converges with the interests of whites. Bell came to this premise by using Brown v. Board of Education, the landmark Supreme Court decision ruling the segregation of public schools unconstitutional, as an historical exemplar to understand the convergence of white and Black interests. He noted how the year 1954, despite the decades of Black advocacy for desegregation that occurred prior to Brown's ruling, served as an ideal time for segregation to legally end in the following ways. One, Brown, through the guise of all men are created equal, gave credibility to the United States fight against communism and efforts to, quote, win the hearts and minds of emerging third world peoples, unquote. Second, Brown offered reassurance to Black men that the ideals of equality and freedom they fought for on behalf of the US abroad would also be granted to Blacks upon their return home. And lastly, Southern whites realized at the time that ending segregation would allow them to industrialize and move from a rural plantation economy and society. To further understand this context, I created a visual for us to envision these converging interests more clearly. In this visual, I also employed the metaphor of loss and gain indicated by the plus and minus sign. Education scholars like Richard Milner, Angelina Castagno, Stacey Lee, and others have put forth when applying the interest convergence framework to explore racial disparity in education research. Here to the right, we see Black Americans, and to the left, we see white Americans as the primary decision makers of the time. And then the top and bottom quadrants respectively represent the metaphor of what was gained and lost for both populations. Derek Bell argued that what Blacks gained as a result of Brown was desegregation and a semblance of quote unquote freedom. And in return, whites lost legalized segregation and the ability to not associate with Blacks. However, what was gained for whites was global credibility and an unaltered status of privilege and power, which was ultimately at the expense of Blacks' desires for substantive racial remediation. Bell concluded that after Brown's ruling, demographic patterns, for example, white flight, de facto segregation, and the racial retaliation toward Blacks in the immediate years after 1954, ultimately minimized any perceived benefits of Brown, which only furthered educational disparities for Blacks. So with this particular understanding of the interest convergence framework, I then consulted a number of secondary sources and conducted informational interviews to understand the history and existing practices of institutional review boards, or what we commonly refer to as IRBs, as the site where the convergence of interest for white academic institutions and communities of color take place. Qualitative methodologist Irving Seidman, for example, noted that the ethical considerations of today stem from past indignities done towards human research subjects. From a global perspective, the Nuremberg trials led to the development of the Nuremberg Code, which established the now universal principle that all research participation must be voluntary. Nationally, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which traced the effects of syphilis without the consent of the study's Black participants, brought forth additional concerns about informed consent and willful participation. What resulted was a national commission outlining principles including respect, beneficence, and justice to further protect participants. And now today, researchers are required to outline a number of participants' rights, with the following being of most importance to our discussion today: the right to privacy and the right to request identities remain confidential. It's this particular area of privacy and identity confidentiality where we as a community have come to understand a research site anonymity to be a quote unquote requirement of the research process. The anonymizing of both participant names and their research site are indeed common methods to ensure participants remain unidentifiable. We've come to think that if we anonymize one, for example, participants' names, then we must also anonymize the other, in other words, the research site. However, my synthesis of secondary sources uncovered important considerations from Seidman in particular about what is actually possible and required for researchers. He wrote, "Informed consent assumes but does not require that the participant will be identified. What it does require is that participants be informed before the interviews begin as to what steps, if any, will be taken to protect their identity." Seidman's insight here reminded me that at their best, IRBs afford us a means to think through the quote unquote steps of our research and plans to protect participants. But these steps, as Seidman noted here, cannot completely ensure participants remain unidentifiable. And more importantly, he emphasized that research site anonymity as a norm within our scholarly practice is a de facto standard rather than a mandated rule we must follow without question. I was able to triangulate this data point in earlier iterations of this talk I gave to IRB representatives around the country. In these discussions, IRB reps admittedly shared that the anonymity of the research site is indeed not one of their immediate and primary concerns. With this historical contemporary understanding, I returned to Derek Bell's interest convergence framework to theorize how IRBs are the site at which the interests of academic institutions converge with those of the research participants. I now bring our attention back to the visual I created and showed earlier when first introducing interest convergence to demonstrate how the framework helps to explain anonymity as a form of methodological racism. We see participants of color to the right and institutions as vessels of white interest to the left. From my synthesis of secondary sources and information interviews, I argue that what participants gain from IRBs is informed and willful consent for voluntary participation. And what institutions lose in return is the ability to conduct unsupervised and blatantly unethical research practices similar to the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. However, with this loss, for institutions comes the gain of a public-facing reputation that the institution is ethically driven and employs humane research practices. But more importantly, what is gained is the distance and benefit that comes from not being explicitly named as a home of racism and systemic oppression. So what's lost for participants of color is the potential of improving their educational experiences that can come from institutional accountability for racism that research site anonymity unfortunately does not provide. In fact, it minimizes racist institutional cultures and sustains racism as socially taboo to be discussed and named, not only in everyday society, as sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva and others have illuminated, but also, as this talk demonstrates, in our research norms and practices. To bring this all full circle and think about the significance of what does anonymity mean then for this current moment in time, when academics say Black Lives Matter, yet Black academics remind us that that is indeed not the case. I look to literature from creative writers to understand how specificity can motivate us to rethink our anonymity practices and ultimately better serve the interests of minoritized communities. I first highlight Naomi Appel's book of writing advice titled The Observation Deck. And in the Get Specific chapter, Appel reminds us that the more detail you give readers, the more you help their imaginations. She continues by stating, clearly it is easier to picture a banana than it is to envision a generic fruit. I love this quote for several reasons. One, it allows us as researchers to envision how specific language can enhance our analysis and findings for our readers. When we come across banana, detailed experiences, connotations, and images come to mind. A banana's ripening texture, its browning with age, the fragrance of potassium hitting the air upon peeling. However, when we read the generic fruit instead, we have an idea about what's to envision, but we're unable to engage the same associated meanings, details, and memories evoked when picturing a banana. We're unable to see and believe the existence of the generic fruit with the same clarity we're able to imagine the banana as something real and known in our consciousness. The other reason I share this quote is because it offers insight into how we may make sense of reading anonymized research sites. For example, it is easier for readers to envision an account of racism at UCLA, in other words, Appel's banana, than West Coast University, in other words, Appel's generic fruit. UCLA is an actual flagship institution with a public reputation and influence that can resonate with our individual histories as academic readers. We can begin to think about our colleagues' experiences at that institution, or our family members' experiences at a neighboring regional campus. We're able to envision a space that is real and imagined in our psyche. In contrast, West Coast University is a vague pseudonym that could be reused to refer to any institution across the Western United States. Surely, researchers can partner the use of West Coast University with a contextualized description of UCLA's status as a flagship institution and documented histories of racism. Yet even when partnered with thick description, using a pseudonym like West Coast University does not equate to the same quality of meaning making done when using the given name of a research site. UCLA elicits a logo, a brand, and a public reputation directly appealing to our personal experiences and connoting myriad positive and our negative associations. So when we anonymize, we inhibit our ability to extend our understanding of that institutional brand, logo, and public reputation, which in turn preserves a culture of silence around the racism and injustice our scholarship may interrogate, but ultimately serves the interests of institutions. Before I close with recommendations for how to actually do anonymity differently moving forward, I share a quote from writer Natalie Goldberg's Writing Down the Bones to reassert the importance of naming. She states, when we know the name of something, it brings us closer to the ground. It takes the blur out of our mind. It connects us to the earth. If I walk down the street and see dogwood, forsythia, I feel more friendly toward the environment. I'm noticing what is around me and I can name it. It makes me more awake. It brings us closer to the ground. That's what naming does, according to Goldberg. It takes the blur out of our mind, it connects us to the earth, and it makes us more awake. As many of you may know, we are currently in a quote unquote woke moment in time. Woke, most simply meaning the past tense of awake, to be alert and aware, represents a period of social justice advocacy and consciousness that at its core is asking us to do better because we know better. When I read Goldberg's words here, I can't help but think that this, for us to be awake, clearing the blur from our minds and standing connected to the earth, is what Black Lives Matter activists, social justice advocates, and students around the country are asking us to do. As scholars, we are all too often willing to affirm racism as something to be theoretically known, studied, and treated as a pervasive social problem for intellectual scrutiny. Yet in practice, through taking for granted research norms like research site anonymity, we often ignore, dismiss, and minimize racism as inconsequential in everyday life. We must name the fact that institutions have much to gain from cultural silence around racism, and we must move beyond the premise that if something is not explicitly quote unquote racist, then it is not doing the work of racism. As Sean Harper reminded the field of education in his presidential address at ARA in April of last year, we should indeed be concerned with evil. However, we should be more concerned with how we are complicit with evil. I invite us all to collectively rethink anonymity practices and how they leave us complicit with the marginalization of communities of color. To close, I want to underscore what we can practically do by returning to where this inquiry began for me, the classroom. Some of my fondest memories from teaching alongside Teresa McCarty were when students would ask thought-provoking questions about the ethical stakes of the research process. Before providing a more detailed response, Dr. McCarty began with a loving smile, pictured here, and a short, "It depends." I too extend a similar loving smile to us all and share that deciding whether to anonymize your research site also depends on a number of factors. First and foremost, what are your participants' needs and desires? What some researchers have found is that consenting adults, for example, sometimes want to be named in the research study as a form of agency. So for higher education researchers like myself, choosing to not anonymize a research site may be more feasible to do in comparison to our colleagues researching K-12 populations or leadership studies. Another factor to consider is your methodological constraints. Are you an ethnographer or case study researcher who may benefit from the added dimension of naming to understand the in-depth context of your site? Or are you using narrative inquiry or conversational analysis, methodologies that may benefit less from naming the specificities of the research site? And lastly, we can ask ourselves, what are our individual personal commitments as a researcher? This question is important to consider as many of us continually revisit the question of the purpose and utility of our work and how it can bring about material change to the lived conditions of marginalized populations. If we happen to be one of these individuals, then maybe questioning our own anonymity practices is another decision point we need to prioritize in our research process. We can do this first by explaining why we decided to not anonymize in the first place. I do understand that current publishing norms provide minimal space for methodological rationales, but thinking through our reasons for anonymizing, whether in a final manuscript or even in our research diaries and analytic memos, will begin to disrupt the existing predilection to default to anonymity without question. Secondly, if we choose to name the research site, we can further protect participants by anonymizing non-essential demographics. For example, if gender or the student's area of study is not central to the study's analytic focus, then these features could be anonymized to further ensure participants remain unidentifiable. Next, it's important to underscore that naming research sites as a form of accountability is not synonymous with quote unquote calling them out for the sake of public shame or cancel culture. Rather, it's done to relate our critiques of the research site to critical social theories, to explain how individual institutions are products of patterned behavior and structural oppression rooted in white supremacy. And finally, it's important to remember that IRBs are dynamic and have more individual latitude than we may think. No single IRB operates exactly the same, so it's important to engage in a discussion with your IRB representatives to gather their thoughts about your decision-making. And if you're junior in your development and you're concerned about the politics of choosing to not anonymize, you may want to speak with trusted colleagues or dissertation committee members if you are a student. Often these individuals have sage advice to provide from experience and may be in complete agreement with the logic and stakes behind your decision to name your research site. My hope today is that we've not only thought about research site anonymity and social science research more broadly in new and equity-minded ways, but also I hope we've gleaned how important the narrowness of this particular line of inquiry is for our larger struggle against white supremacy and its hold on the academic enterprise. For myself, I think about the 200 plus years that Black folks endured chattel slavery in this country. Thereafter was close to 100 years of legalized segregation. And now we've experienced close to 60 years of quote unquote freedom. In addition to this timeline, we can think about the centuries of settler colonialism and erasure of indigenous populations, as well as the decades of anti-Asian, Latinx, Middle Eastern xenophobia, immigration, policies, ableism, heterosexism, and other isms and phobias. In total, that is over 300 plus years of legalized white, cis, hetero, patriarchal terror and state-sanctioned violence against minoritized bodies. And that means that we as an academic community have over 300 plus years of work, from creating and implementing culturally specific policy to unlearning taken for granted research practices like research site anonymity that must be done to undo the ills and permanence, as Derek Bell would say, of racism. My desire is that we not leave today's talk inspired, but rather committed to the discipline that's needed to carry out meaningful equity-minded practice each and every day we step foot on our campus, either in person or virtually. That commitment is needed. That level of care is currently lacking. And that attention to detail is paramount to creating new possibilities and outcomes for not only marginalized folks, but quite frankly, for us all. To close, I want to acknowledge the journey that it has taken to get these ideas to the shareable state that they're in today. Previous iterations of this talk and of this work were met with a lot of pushback and blanket rejection. So to conclude, I invite us all to reflect on what it means to question what we've come to assume as normal and standard as academic professionals. Such questioning elicits emotions, which when we sit and listen to them are often our best teachers. So as we move into the Q&A, I ask us to reflect on the following questions. What thoughts, feelings, and points of resonance and our dissonance have come up for us in today's talk? How might these developments relate to our individual comfort and our discomfort with intentionally interrogating race and racism? And lastly, what other taken for granted methodological and academic norms may reinscribe racism and have yet to be questioned? With that, I thank you all for your listening ear, time, and attention, and I turn things over back to Dr. Martinez for the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Moses. I'm seeing some applause. I hope you can imagine what that's sounding like. Okay, I'd like to open up this session for folks that have questions for Dr. Moses. Please either raise your hand or unmute to get us started. I see Paco, then McCall.
Thank you very, very much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about, so I work with students in our EDD program, and most of them do the kind of practices that you're describing, like anonymize the institutions that they're getting their data from. And so one thing that comes up in those discussions I have with them about whether they're going to anonymize the site or not is that they feel that they wouldn't get permission from their institution without anonymizing. And more broadly, like in some of my work working with school districts, and they often say, we'll share data, but you can't name the site. And I'm just wondering if you had thoughts about, so this is not really an IRB issue, so I apologize for this, is a little bit different from kind of like the thrust of your talk, but if you had any thoughts about kind of like the implications of that and the ethics of that, and I'm just really curious to your thoughts about those issues.
Yes, Paco, thank you for that question. And no apologies, because it's different from the IRB piece, because it has many implications beyond just IRBs. It has implications for the participants that we work with. And I think for me, that speaks first and foremost to where our allegiances should lie, right? Particularly when disseminating this work to academic circles or public outlets. If our participants are not comfortable, if our school districts are not comfortable with us naming the research site, then as ethical researchers, I firmly believe that that's where our allegiance should lie, right? I do think there could be possibly a conversation to have internally with the school districts or with the leadership boards that we're working with about how we can have candid conversations about this work and the issues and the practices within our internal network. But in regards to external sort of dissemination, I do firmly believe that if there's an order of operations, your participants' desires and needs matter most. And even if those desires and needs are about covering up some of the ills that are rooted in social oppression, it's a gift to do work with these communities. And I think sometimes protecting that sort of trust and allegiance and just faith on their end is of most importance, right? But as researchers, we can continue to interrogate and have questions in our analytic memos, in our research diaries. There's a way to still sort of disrupt this larger sort of predilection that we have to just defaulting without questioning it to do so. And so all this to say, yes, if your participants are not comfortable with it, then respect that, right?
Thank you.
McCall, go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you just for a great talk. I have to say, I wanted to be a student in your class as I was listening to you talk, because you just give such a great, I was completely absorbed. So just a really fabulous talk, Michael. I had lots of questions. One of them was Paco. So thanks, Paco. I was also thinking about advising. Also as chair, I sign off on everybody's IRB, and it just raised so many questions for me that I just don't even, it was very thought provoking on that. And I guess I did want to ask you a little bit, just like a lot of your, you got to this micro level questions, but a lot of the questions that your talk raised, especially at the beginning, were about larger issues about the academy for me that you raised. And I wanted to just to have you kind of think aloud about that as I think about protecting junior faculty, especially faculty of color, and the kind of the enterprise of the academy and the way in which we have our own work to do in dismantling structural racism that kind of leads to the inequalities that I think don't go away once we're in academia. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that, and how in the role of and I mean, it's not just IRB, but just really about protecting also researchers and their efforts to call out a lot of how we've, just how the Academy functions. And just no specific question there so much as just wanted you to help us think out loud about that larger question.
Yeah, a very large but really important question. And I think for me, when I engage in this work and other sort of particularly methodological inquiries, but then also like inquiries around academic writing practices and the absence of essentially conversations around race and gender when it comes to academic writing practices, is that there's so much in like the everyday sort of subtleties of this work that have ramifications, at least in my mind, for the larger sort of implications that you're inviting us to think more closely here. And so I guess this particular line of inquiry for me speaks to this larger sort of idea of methodological niceness that I'm trying to work through and think through. And so Angelina Castagno, she writes about sort of like, there's a particular phrasing that they use in Utah, but Utah niceness, right? And how that is essentially a proxy for whiteness. And so I'm thinking through how sort of the everyday sort of implications of what does it mean to be nice, agreeable, and to just do traditional things without questioning why the traditional things are done. It's something that we also do within our methodological practices. So I'm not only thinking about, anonymity, I'm thinking about sort of like a content and textual analysis around those practices within the field of education research, qualitative and higher education research, because I think for me, it again speaks to this larger sort of framework of racial microaggressions, if you will, where it's this idea of like the everyday and the subtleties and the nuances speaks to larger sort of systemic and structural issues that we see in the academy. And so these decision points that we sort of subscribe to as academics is one sort of manifestation of that for me. And when it comes to this question of, early career faculty members of color and projecting the critical and innovative work that they're doing that's pushing these boundaries, I'm thinking about this also in this larger sort of anti-CRT moment in time. And how do we do that work, knowing that, in some respects, CRT is as most popular as it's ever been in this weird sort of way. But that's partly because people aren't reading actually what the work is and what it actually means to represent. And I think I'm saying all this to say, I think there's so much good literature out there, not only within CRT and the law, CRT and education, but now moving into like CRT and in the medical field, and outside of CRT and ethnic studies that we can cite to help us make the claims that we're making within the field of education. And so particularly when I think about the writing that I'm doing now, but then also my other colleagues who are early career, I'm encouraging all of us to read outside of our field, to use that as language and support to make the claims that we're trying to make within the field of education. And so that's one way to think about protection, is like, let's use our colleagues in other fields to push the claims and the insights that we're making within our own area of study.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moses. I was also just really engaged in your talk, and I'm so glad we have this recorded, because I can imagine us using this or just prompting conversations as we talk to our graduate students and our research teams about how we should engage in deciding, right, anonymity or not. To me, one thing that struck me is when you were talking about UCLA, right, and as a higher ed scholar, we see West Coast University many times, and we almost know, what they're referring to. It's usually UCLA or maybe the rival institution across the other side of the tent. But what that also strikes to me is this notion of the hierarchy that's in higher ed, right, of status of institutions. And so I know one of the tensions I feel when I'm writing or doing research on institutions that maybe don't have that status, and kind of naming them may kind of also like make other institutions feel like, well, that's not our problem, right? That's that institution's problem. So how do we handle maybe that tension in thinking about status and hierarchy, especially particularly in the context of higher ed with these institutions and naming or not naming?
Yeah, no, really thoughtful question there. And that's one sort of dimension that there's only so much space in a journal manuscript, right? And so there's always this ongoing conversation. And this piece about, the hierarchy of institutions, right? What does it say if we're doing this actually at Vassar College or, Pomona College? And what are the stakes of naming there? Particularly that they may not have the same sort of public cachet or reputation or sort of current sort of event appeal as a UCLA or, any UC for that matter. But what I really sort of think about is like, again, naming allows us like the depth and the context into the space, right? And it sort of preserves that memory for us. But then it's also extremely important to relate that naming and that individualizing of the campus to the social theories that we have, not only in education, but from the sociologies, the anthropologies, the ethnic studies of the world. Because I think it's that really fine-tuned detailing of one, naming that tension that you mentioned, but then always explicating it back to how, but this is how this individual site has ramifications and implications for pattern behavior that we see across institutions, right? Regardless of regional type or Carnegie status or what have you. And so maybe this is a call as well for a greater application of critical social theories and maybe higher ed or just education research more broadly, because I think we could be, I think we are in great conversation with our colleagues in ethnic studies and sociology and elsewhere. I think them learning from us sometimes could be a more amenable relationship. But it's that sort of thing that I think really helps us think through this tension of like, making sure readers understand that it's not just this institution. It's not just the UCLAs of the world. This has implications for all of us. And it's really leveraging the critical social theory there in our discussion section, in our explication of what these findings means, that I think really gets at that particular, crux of the matter.
Great. I have a question. Thank you so much for the talk as well. It really resonates with some things that I've been thinking about recently and talking with graduate students, not only in education, but also in cultural studies. The thing that I was wondering about was pseudonyms in studies. And make this really, so I work in writing studies. And I think the notion of not having, there's a question about sites, but research participants, allowing them to be named directly, some cases is not so much, it's not possible. But one of the things I've been wrestling with is if you're going to have pseudonyms, like what's your take on allowing participants to choose their own pseudonyms, being assigned pseudonyms? Are the thing that I think your talk really made me think about is the possibility of allowing participants, particularly adult participants or college student participants, to either choose whether they had, used their names, selected a pseudonym, or allowed the researcher. And so I was just wondering what your take on pseudonyms and also participant agency in selecting a pseudonym would be. And thank you so much for the talk.
No, thank you all for you all's interest and really thoughtful questions. So I'll share my personal take, but then I'll share my sort of, I think all of us can sort of subscribe to this sort of take. I love thinking of participant pseudonyms. I have like a running list in my phone notepad of just like names that I feel like does a nice job of capturing the participants' just color and aesthetic and personality and all the things, right? And so that's just me being a nerd, right? But I say that to say, in general, I think, to this word that you used of agency, it's important for it to be an ongoing conversation, right? So usually when I show up and we consent and I explain sort of the parameters of the study and what participation looks like, yada yada, and I have a demographic questionnaire, I have, would you like to use your given name? Would you like to use a pseudonym? But that's really just to begin a conversation, engage their thoughts in that initial sort of interview, right? Because it's going to take time for me to finish up subsequent interviews if those are being done, doing all the coding, do all the analysis, doing all the writing up. So by the end of the the sort of definitive end of participant interaction, or even just in the writing, we can continue to sort of engage this conversation, and it's something that we can revisit. And so I like to think about pseudonym selection and the finalizing of pseudonyms as, again, an ongoing process. Similar to like whether or not you're comfortable with us anonymizing the site, what would you like for your pseudonym to be? Are you comfortable with a pseudonym or your given name? It's not something that needs to be decided today in our first interaction. I want there to be some sort of organic time and development for a conclusion to come there as well. So I like for that to be, again, something that we sort of organically come back to over time, but we start the conversation today in the first interaction, if that makes sense. So yes, I may come to them with my sort of selected name just upon personality and things like that, but then at the end of the day, it's a conversation that we ultimately sort of conclude on an agreement by the end of the process.
All right, Michael, I just really want to thank you for this talk. I think for those students who are here in my class, we just read Savannah Shanjay's book. Yeah, and when she talks about her naming process, so this is really thoughtful and really much an extension of the conversation that she makes us think about in terms of naming places. But I really appreciate your nuancing of what it means to name in or not use a pseudonym in higher ed versus K-12. I think that was very important for you to untangle. So just want to thank you for joining us here in the School of Education, specifically in the graduate group in education. And yeah, I look forward to following your work and hopefully being in conversation soon if we ever get back to conferences.
Thank you all again for your presence, the invitation to speak with you all. I really appreciate it. And again, this is an ongoing conversation. So in subsequent things that I plan on writing, I know I'm going to revisit this idea of hierarchy, just in the ongoing process of like, what does anonymity actually look like in the research? So thank you all so much.